Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Research Exchange Seminar. I'm Kostas Panos. I'm the Director of CITRIS and Professor of ECS. And I would like to welcome you and also the web viewers, including those from the other CITRIS campuses, Davis, Merced, and Santa Cruz. Just a few utilitarian announcements. Everything in your lunch is compostable, I believe. So please use the green bins at the back of for the compost. And finally, it's not customary to interrupt the speaker during the talk with questions, but there's going to be some time in the afternoon, later after the talk, for Q&A. There are a few upcoming events that I would like you to know about. CITRIS and the Banatao Institute and Microsoft will host a symposium next Wednesday that is dedicated to exploring the effects of AI-enabled technologies on labor, law enforcement, and public services. For more information or to register, visit inclusiveai.eventbrite.com. So this is the Inclusive AI event that we have been planning for a while, and I think it's going to be very worthwhile for your time. Another event on June 8th, CITRIS will host a one-day symposium with INRIA about the technology behind blockchain, its promise for cybersecurity, and its application in public interest domains in the US and Europe. The event will include keynote addresses, lightning talks, and panel discussions. Again, for more information, you can visit blockchain and socialimpact.eventbrite.com. So that is on June 8th. So I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Tom Kalil. Tom just reminded me that he was first recruited to California by Dean Richard Newton in 2001 when CITRIS was started. And so we're very glad to have you back. He has served in between, in some very important posts in the White House for 16 years for two presidents. Actually, one of them was before CITRIS, President Clinton and then President Obama. Until January 2017, he served as Deputy Director for Technology and Innovation of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy and Senior Advisor to the National Economic Council. He's currently an entrepreneur in residence at UC Berkeley and Senior Advisor for the Eric and Wendy Schmidt Group. So Tom, very glad to have you.
Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure for me to be here and to be back on the Berkeley campus. I really enjoyed the 8 years I spent at UC Berkeley from 2001 to 2008. And I'm going to talk today about the role that policy entrepreneurs play in the policy process and start off by defining what a policy entrepreneur is and why you should care and how it is that they get things done. So in the same way that an entrepreneur that is interested in commercial things is interested in identifying some unmet need in the market and then addressing that unmet need with some new product or service or business model, a policy entrepreneur is interested in identifying some challenge or opportunity that can be addressed through some change in public policy. And the reason that you might care about this phenomena of policy entrepreneurship is that at some point in your career you might want to be one. So we have a number of UC Berkeley faculty and students that have engaged in public service during some point in their career. And so you might want to know, well, what are the opportunities and can individuals really make a difference? Spoiler alert, the answer is yes. And the other reason that you might want to know is that you might not want to go work in government full time, but you might have an idea and be interested in how you can interact more effectively with people in government to drive some sort of an agenda. So the first thing I want to talk about is for a policy entrepreneur, particularly one who's serving in the White House, which I had an opportunity to do for both President Clinton and President Obama. One question that I think is important is, where do ideas come from, right? So if you think about a policy entrepreneur as having an idea and then trying to figure out, how do I advance that idea? That's an interesting starting point, is to say, where do these ideas come from? And so one is obviously that if you are working in the White House, one of the places those ideas come from is the President of the United States. So every once in a while, he would bring White House officials into the Oval Office and say, I want you to work on this thing. And the answer to that would be, yes, sir. Or yes, ma'am, as the case may be. One example of that was he was really interested in precision medicine. So that was not an idea that we pitched him on. It was an idea that he told us to work on. Another example is the president would occasionally visit with CEOs and members of the research community in California and other places, and would come back with a question and ask us to do some further exploration of this. So one example of that is that the president got very interested in artificial intelligence, and that led to a policy process around that topic. So that's one source. A second is that in both sort of formal and informal ways, we would ask the outside world the questions that we were asking ourselves. So one of the questions that I was interested in was, in the same way that President Kennedy said, let's put astronauts on the moon and have them safely return by the end of the decade, and we also decided to sequence the human genome and drive down the cost of that from $100 million to $1,000. What are the similarly ambitious but achievable goals that we should be setting in the 21st century? And every once in a while, I would get an answer to that question. The Kavli Foundation and some other foundations organized a workshop that had some researchers from neuroscience and some researchers from the physical sciences and engineering. And out of that workshop came the kernel of the idea, which led to the BRAIN Initiative. And the idea was, if you ask neuroscientists, why don't we have a theory about how the brain encodes and processes information? One of the answers is that we're limited by our tools. So, for example, we can measure the activity of a very small number of neurons with high levels of temporal and spatial resolution, or we can take a fuzzy picture of your entire brain using something like fMRI. But at the level of neural circuits that might be composed of hundreds of thousands or millions of neurons, we don't have the tools that are necessary to measure their real-time interaction. So the hypothesis of the BRAIN Initiative is that that goal is now within reach, the ability, for example, to do recording of large-scale neural circuits. And if we could pull that off, that would lead to fundamental advances in our understanding of how the brain encodes and processes information. It might lead to advances in computing that are inspired by human brains, how human brains work. And it could improve our ability to diagnose, treat, and prevent diseases of the brain. And as a result of that idea, the president got behind this, and the public and private sectors have now invested $3 billion to help launch the BRAIN Initiative. So asking the world the questions that you're asking yourselves is another source of ideas. Crises. Crises can generate new ideas. So when the Ebola outbreak occurred, I was aware that DARPA was doing work to dramatically reduce the time to go from bug to drug. As a result of the Ebola outbreak, that Congress was going to pass an emergency bill to provide additional funding to address that. And in that context, we were able to get some additional funding. So crises is another source of ideas and opens up policy windows. Advisory committees. So we had an advisory committee called the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology that generated a bunch of ideas, some of which were ultimately embraced by the president. So the president got behind the idea of preparing and recruiting an additional 100,000 high-quality math and science teachers over the next 10 years, which was an idea that was first proposed by the PCAST. there were some ideas that we were already committed to when we walked in the door. When I worked for President Clinton, I got excited about the idea of using incentive prizes, was able to work to get DARPA prize authority. They used it for the self-driving car competition. The second time they held that competition, Sebastian Thrun won the competition. The head of Google, Larry Page, was at the finish line, and he promptly acquired the winning team, which is the source of the Google effort in self-driving cars. So when I came back to work for President Obama, I knew that this is one of the things that I wanted to work on. So a lot of times when people show up having at least one idea that they want to continue to work on. Our laboratories of democracy. So a lot of times ideas that are embraced at the federal level are those that where there's been already some level of experimentation at the state and local level. Or at the international level, we might try to learn from what other countries are doing. So there's a lot of interest in learning from how Germany and Switzerland do apprenticeship programs, for example. And then kind of more informal interactions that we have both with people inside and outside the government. So in the same way that a venture capitalist is interested in high quality deal flow, what are some exciting startups that they could be investing in? The job of a policy entrepreneur is to have some mechanism where lots of people are bringing them ideas, some fraction of which they will ultimately decide that they should get behind. Well, the next question is, all right, so you've got this idea and you want to move it forward. What are the different mechanisms that you have for doing that? And again, if you are working in the White House, there are a variety of different tools that you have. And some of these tools are also accessible to people that are working in federal departments and agencies. So one is the president's budget. So when I was working for President Clinton, in the late 1990s, I started to interact with a group of federal program managers that was interested in nanoscale science and engineering. And the idea was that at the nanoscale, not only are things smaller, they have novel and potentially useful properties. And if we could increase our fundamental understanding of those properties, and then from a technological point of view, figure out how to make nanomaterials, devices, and structures, that would lead to a wave of innovation. And so President Clinton went to Caltech and gave a speech unveiling the National Nanotechnology Initiative. And as a result, the federal government has increased its investment in nanoscale science and engineering by $23 billion. And a bunch of other countries have copied the United States and created their own version of that. So the budget is one tool that a policy entrepreneur has to move an idea forward if it's something that requires additional investment. The second is working with Congress on legislation. So for example, I worked with Congress in 2010 to pass legislation that gave every agency the authority to support incentive prizes. And in 2012, on legislation that made it easier for startups to raise capital and go public, including through equity-based crowdfunding and creating an IPO on-ramp so that emerging growth companies would find it easier to go public without being subject to a number of the regulations that larger companies are subject to. A third tool that we have is executive action. So this is identifying something where a department already has the authority to do something, they just haven't done it yet. So when it became clear that the Congress was not going to pass comprehensive immigration legislation, we were able to identify an authority that the Department of Homeland Security had and to propose and finalize something called the International Entrepreneur Rule that would allow the United States to bring in an unlimited number of immigrant entrepreneurs that have already attracted investment from either public or private investors. So there had been a legislative proposal called Startup Visa, which would have created a new visa category. So ideally, Congress would have passed a law, but we were still able to make some progress on this by identifying an authority that a relevant agency already had. We will occasionally work on a whole of government strategy. So a lot of problems, like the problem of combating antibiotic-resistant bacteria, are sufficiently complex so that there's no single department and agency that can solve this problem. So the FDA has to work on the approval process. The Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services has to figure out how they're going to pay for it. The NIH might need to fund research and development or figure out how to create a clinical trial network. So a lot of problems require interagency coordination of bringing together agencies and saying, can we have a shared vision about what would constitute progress and who's going to need to do what in order to make progress on this particular issue. In some cases, the White House or the Congress will create new organizations. So after Sputnik, the federal government created DARPA to avoid technological surprise for the United States and to create it for our adversaries. After the less than successful rollout of healthcare.gov, the administration recruited top technical talent from some of our leading tech companies like Google and Amazon and Microsoft. And in a relatively short period of time, they were able to fix healthcare.gov. And then the president appropriately asked, why don't we have these people at the beginning of the process as opposed to waiting until there's a crisis? And so we created a new organization called the United States Digital Service to bring in top technical talent to dramatically improve our ability to design and develop citizen-facing digital services using modern techniques like modern technology stacks and human-centered design and agile approaches to software development. So sometimes it's necessary to create an entire new organization. The president would also use his bully pulpit and his ability to convene individuals and organizations and challenge them to do something or call attention to particular issues. So very early on in his administration, he said, you know, if you win the NCAA or the Super Bowl, you get to come to the White House. The same thing should be true if you win a science fair or a robotics competition. So he had, every year he had a White House science fair, which made the White House staff feel like slackers because there would be 16-year-olds who were working on functionalized gold nanoparticles for smart anti-cancer therapeutics. And I don't know about you, but when I was 16, I was not working on a cure for cancer. But what he was really trying to do is to sort of change the culture. As Dean Kamen used to say, in a free society, you get what you celebrate. And so he was interested in inspiring and empowering more young people to excel in science, technology, engineering, and math by trying to send a consistent message that this is important. And so we would also use those science fairs and other similar events like that, not just to have the president, you know, walk around and see a bunch of amazing young people, or in some cases adults. We would also use that as an artificial deadline to try to generate commitments that both government agencies and the private sector were willing to make. So a lot of what we did was to leverage the president's bully pulpit by trying to build coalitions around particular issues. And the way that I used to get the members of my team to think about this was to provide the following thought experiment, which is that you have a magic laptop. And the power of the laptop is that any press release that you write will come true. And what you need to do is to generate a headline that is a goal statement, several paragraphs to provide context, and paragraph level descriptions of who is agreeing to do what in the form organization A takes action B so that C. And the constraint is that it had to be at least plausible that if the right person like called up all these organizations, that they would be both willing and able. So for example, you couldn't ask a for-profit firm to take some action that was directly contrary to the interests of their shareholders, or you couldn't ask an agency to do something that was illegal unless your press release also included Congress passes a law such that. And there were a couple reasons why that was a useful thought experiment. One is that in any job or role that you have some notion of what in your environment is fixed and what is potentially changeable. And if you have the ability to send a decision memo to the President of the United States and have him check the box that says yes, your view about what is potentially changeable should be fairly expansive. The second reason is that there is a value in concreteness. And what I mean by that is things happen in the world when particular individuals and organizations do something. And if you're trying to achieve some particular goal and you can't articulate who would need to do what, you are still in research mode. You know, once you've identified, okay, I think that there should be a brain initiative that's aimed at creating new tools that will dramatically accelerate progress in neuroscience in the same way that the Human Genome Project did for genetics. And I know that I need to get the heads of these 3 science agencies to agree to put some funding into it. Then I can begin to go out and test the hypothesis that that I would be able to make progress in this particular area. So that's a little bit about some of the tools that we had. Now, there were also some barriers that policy entrepreneurs encounter. So I don't want to make it seem like it's, oh, you have an idea, you call a couple people, boom, you're off to the races. So you have this phenomena of divided government. So you can have the executive branch, as it was for 6 out of President Obama's 8 years, the executive branch controlled by one party, and the Congress controlled by another party. So there were a lot of instances where I was able to get the president to endorse an idea. So we had an idea for a DARPA for education, an entity that would do for education what DARPA has done for the military. And the president put it in his budget, and we just could not convince certain members of Congress to go along with this idea. So that's one challenge. It's made particularly, that problem has gotten worse because of a phenomena that political scientists call polarization. So if you go back and look at the history of American politics, there were times when Republicans from the Northeast were more liberal on many issues than Democrats were from the South. So you had lots of, Democratic-Republican agreement because the two parties were not as sharply divided along ideological lines, and there was not this view that compromise or looking for compromise was sort of like a dirty word that should get you hounded out of office. There are also unintended consequences of laws that have been passed decades ago. And an example of this is there was legislation passed called the Paperwork Reduction Act. And the goal of the Paperwork Reduction Act was to prevent the federal government from inflicting too many information collection requirements on citizens and businesses. And so so they were trying to prevent a situation where government agencies had essentially an unlimited ability to send out lots of forms and collect lots of information. This has actually limited the ability of the federal government to do agile software development, because what you want to do is create a prototype of something and then get feedback from customers about whether or not the service is meeting their needs. And this is made more difficult by the Paperwork Reduction Act. Certainly not something that the authors of that law in the 1970s or 80s, whenever it was passed, contemplated. And so when a number of the sort members of the US Digital Service and the Presidential Innovation Fellow Program met with the president, and he said, if I could do one thing, to make your job easier, what would it be? They said, well, you would repeal the Paperwork Reduction Act, which was certainly not what he was expecting. So those are some of the barriers that exist for policy entrepreneurs. I'm going to talk a little bit about what are some of the skills or dispositions that it is useful for policy entrepreneurs to have. One is the ability to get excited about other people's ideas. So if you think about an academic, if you went and wrote literature reviews about other people's research, is it likely that you would get tenure? Anyone? No, right? So your incentive structure is to come up with an important and unique intellectual contribution that either you have done or it might be the result of a collaboration as well. But a lot of times people want to know what's your unique intellectual contribution. So obviously, this creates an incentive for you to go out and talk about your own work. And a policy entrepreneur can say, well, I don't have to be the person who came up with this idea. So for example, I was not sitting at my desk saying, I wonder if there's a new opportunity to transform neuroscience. This was an idea that was brought to me by the research community. So in many cases, I was not generating these ideas, but I was in a position to add some value in the process. And so having the ability to get excited about the ideas of others dramatically increases the number of things that you can work on, as opposed to limiting yourself to the ideas that you feel some sort of personal authorship for. A second is the importance of being able to exert influence without authority. And there are lots of instances where you do not have some direct command and control relationship with the individuals or organizations that you're trying to get to do something. Now, sometimes that works, right? So for example, if the president signs an executive order directing an agency to do something, then you can say, the president really wants you to do this, and if you don't want to do it, you're going to have to take it up with him, right? So sometimes there is sort of the passing along of direct edicts or directives from the president, but it is far more likely the case that what you're trying to do is to create a coalition of the willing and able. And in order to do that successfully, you have to figure out what are the mechanisms for being able to exert influence even if you're not exercising formal authority. And I'll give you one approach that I found to be very useful, which was to have lots of relationships with people both inside and outside the government that were based on trust, mutual understanding, and reciprocity. So trust, that's really important because you want people to believe that if you say that you're going to do something, that you're going to make your level best effort to actually do that. If they ask you to hold some piece of information in confidence, you're not going to tweet about it immediately. So trust is really important. Mutual understanding is important because you want to understand what gets them out of bed in the morning. What is their incentive structure? What are they excited about working on? What constraints and opportunities do they face? What's easy for them to do? What's really hard for them to do? And reciprocity is that you do not want this to be a one-way street. So, for example, if you have a friend and the only time you hear from this friend is when they need help moving, that relationship is going to get old over time. And so I discovered that if I wanted to maintain strong relationships with the leadership of the different departments and agencies, that if they perceived that that relationship was a steady stream of requests from me to them, that they would not be all that excited about talking to me. But if if I understood what they were trying to accomplish and how I could be helpful to them, we would have a much more productive relationship. Persistence is also very important. One of the members of my team, Kumar Garg, had a whiteboard with all of the aphorisms that we used most frequently to try to figure out how to move ideas forward. And one of them was water on stone, by which we meant that a lot of times it was not the first meeting that you had on a topic, it was like the 5th meeting that you had. And that a lot of times you had to convince someone that you were really serious and that you weren't going away. And that's what would, finally get them to engage and start delivering on something. And then finally, I think it's also important for policy entrepreneurs to be somewhere in the middle between optimism and pessimism. So, if you're like really, really strong optimist and you believe that, it's inevitable that the future will be better than it is today, then, the question about why you would engage in public service, I think, is an open one. If you're a pessimist and you believe that, and you're really deeply cynical and your view is that, the system is rigged and it can't possibly get better, then it's also sort of an open question about why you would engage in public service. So one of our aphorisms was, it's better to light a single candle than cry out at the darkness. So we definitely thought that it was better to be in the game and try to improve things than just to assume that it's not our engagement wouldn't make a difference. And so this is a philosophy called meliorism, which means things can get better, but only if people work at it. And so I think that's a sort of a constructive philosophy for a would-be policy entrepreneur to have. The last thing I want to talk about is, and then we're going to go to questions, is I think there's an opportunity to, and this is particularly important for anyone who's in a policy school or might be watching this, who's from a policy school, which is what's the opportunity to democratize the knowledge that policy entrepreneurs have. Because people who have done this for a while acquire a lot of tacit knowledge that is sometimes difficult to communicate in the same way that it would be difficult, once you had learned how to ride a bike, to write a paper about how to ride a bike. And so one of the things that I'm interested in is there some way for universities to capture and organize and curate the information that people who have done this successfully have acquired, and to try to figure out how to make some of that knowledge more explicit and less tacit. And so a great example of this is there were a team of folks who'd worked on the Congress and came up with a playbook for, hey, if you want to put pressure on our bosses, here's how you do it. This led to a grassroots movement called Indivisible, and I think there's about 6,000 of these communities all over the country that are using this sort of knowledge that certainly Hill staff had, but it had really never been written down, to be able to hold their members of Congress more accountable for things that citizens either want their members to do, or in some cases to not do. And so one of the things that I think would help move this field forward and also make government more transparent is, as I said, to try to capture some of this knowledge. Because one of the problems that I had all the time is that someone would arrive in my office to have a conversation, and the conversation would go something like this. Tom, I think that the issue that I work on is really important. And I would say, okay, let's say that I'm prepared to stipulate it. What is it that you would like the administration to do with respect to this issue? And they would say, well, you should make it a priority. And I'd say, well, what would that look like? Well, you'd have a strategy for addressing this issue. And the problem was that to them, the government was a black box. So they really didn't have any conception of what it is. If the government said, yes, absolutely, your issue is important, we want to do more in this area, they didn't have a sense for what that would even look like. And so, I think that that capturing and sharing more of this information that a lot of times is in the heads of people who have done this for a while would improve the functioning of our democracy, and I think could be a really important and useful role for policy schools. Now, occasionally, you'll see people doing oral history, but a lot of times that oral history is done from the point of view of trying to figure out, what happened in some particular historical moment in time, not saying, well, what is it that you learned that if we wrote down and shared and organized could be useful for people who want to be more active citizens and promote a vibrant democracy. So that's my story. I'm sticking to it, and happy to answer any questions that you have about my tours of duty at the White House.
Hi, thank you for the talk. It sounds like you want a case study system, the way that business managers are taught with cases that typically Harvard Business School and other schools present, where people are given the circumstances governing a decision, a different course of action, and then it's read, but the students don't know necessarily what happened. It's sometimes masked as to what company was involved. It sounds like you want something like that for policymakers, and to make it a sort of popular democratic form. Is that the kind of educational material that you're suggesting would be useful? And I say this as someone who read the Indivisible Guide and is an Indivisible member.
Yeah, so I think case studies are useful. I think the other thing that's useful is, again, there's a lot of tacit knowledge that policymakers accumulate during their time in office that is not shared. So an example is, to the story about the individual who can't articulate what it is that they want the government to do because they might have a goal, but policymaking requires this coherent relationship between means and ends. And so if you have no idea what are the means of government, it's going to be more difficult for you to generate concrete and specific ideas. So case studies would be useful, but these sort of playbooks, like the type that Indivisible did around putting pressure on members of Congress, but for a much wider set of institutions, I think that would be useful as well.
My question has two parts related to global challenges and prizes.
Yes.
Could you comment on what you think the future of prizes are as it relates to solving global challenges?
Yes.
And then could you identify where you think prizes are particularly applicable and perhaps where they are not?
Yeah. So to address the second part first, so they do well where it's possible to articulate a clear finish line. So something that was responsible for the modern renaissance in the use of prizes was the Ansari X Prize. And they said, what we want to demonstrate is that space is not just for governments anymore. So we're going to provide a $10 million prize for the first privately funded team that can build a rocket, carry the equivalent of 3 people, go up 100 kilometers, and repeat that within a short period of time. And so the judging was very straightforward. If, on the other hand, it's more of a, I'll know it when I see it, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, then I think the incentive prize mechanism works less well. It's also not going to work if the amount of the prize and the investment required to achieve that are wildly disproportionate. So for example, you wouldn't go to the high energy physics community and say, I'm going to give you $1 million prize if you discover the Higgs boson, and all you have to do is raise billions of dollars to build the Large Hadron Collider. So there has to be some proportionate relationship between the incentive and the investment that would be required. Let me tell you about where I would like the future of this mechanism to go, which is the increased use of milestone payments. And let me tell you what I mean by that. a lot of times a problem is sufficiently complex so that an individual or a small team is not likely to be able to solve the problem with the resources that they have under their control. So, for example, when NASA retired the space shuttle, and we wanted to go up to the International Space Station, we had to pay the Russians a lot of money to use their Soyuz rockets. So we wanted a US rocket that was capable of delivering and retrieving cargo and then ultimately astronauts. And so NASA partnered with SpaceX, and they didn't say, once you have the rocket, then we'll buy it. They said, let's define 18 milestones associated with progress towards developing that rocket. And every time that you meet one of them, we will send you a check. And so that's what allowed Elon to finance the development of the Falcon 9. So for problems that are more ambitious in nature, I don't think that it's always going to be the case that one giant pot of gold at the end of the rainbow will be enough to get us there. We may have to identify a set of intermediate milestones with a large enough cash payment to get you to the next milestone.
I have Tom over here on the right.
Yep.
Your left.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I have potentially two questions. First, so you laid out a policy entrepreneurship framework, ideas, tools, skills, barriers, so forth, that seem to be focused on the federal government.
Yes.
Have you thought about applying that to local government or even university organizations?
Yeah, no, I think that a lot of these skills, I mean, the details are going to be different, but I think that a lot of these skills, like having a broad network of people who are bringing you ideas, the ability to get excited about other people's ideas, the ability to exert influence without authority, having a network of relationships based on trust, mutual understanding, and reciprocity. I think these are things that can sort of carry, that can be useful in lots of different contexts. The specifics are going to vary a lot, but I think a lot of the general framework would still be useful, even if you were somewhere other than the White House or the federal government.
And my second quick question is, and I ask this caveat saying, I'm not partisan, so don't misinterpret this. So often entrepreneurs, in contrast to bureaucrats, are focused on efficiently marshaling resources, not just creating lots of resources. And so is there trade-offs when you think about ideas like an ARPA for education, where you think, well, maybe government doesn't need to expand, maybe it's too big, maybe we can do this without hiring more people and organization?
Absolutely. So you could have policy entrepreneurship that was about identifying opportunities for the government to do less. So it doesn't need, policy entrepreneurship is not just about increasing the size and scale of the government, or it's about entrepreneurship that is related to reducing the barriers to private sector innovation. So remember some of the ideas that I talked about. A law that made it easier for startups to raise capital and go public. That was about allowing the private sector to flourish, not about expanding the size of government.
I have two questions. One is sort of a broad general question, and the other one is specifically federal government oriented. So the first question is, how do you see social media in terms of the policy entrepreneurship you've described being used as tools in the immediate future and long term? I was reading an article in the New York Times yesterday about a website that's defining excess food use and how it's addressing regulations in that effect. How do you see digital media, specifically social?
Yeah.
The second question, which is very specific, is I'm familiar with the SBIR program, which is the grant program for business government policy for developing new innovation. How would you see that being used for your ideas about prizes? Because many of the kinds of issues you've raised, I actually saw in some of the descriptions of where they were granting money.
Yeah. So on the SBIR, my own personal view is so this is a program that is now several $1 billion. It's a set aside. I think it's about up to 3.5% of total federal extramural support for research and development. I'd love to see more of it being used in a prize mechanism. again, prizes are not the right tool for every circumstance, but some of the advantages are that it allows the government to establish a goal by being agnostic about which individual or team is most likely to be successful, and allows you to reach out to a much broader range of potential solvers. So the Air Force was interested in solving the problem of you're at a checkpoint, you have an approaching vehicle, you've asked the vehicle to stop, it has not stopped, you would like to stop the vehicle without harming the vehicle or the occupant. They put that problem out there. The winning idea came from a retired mechanical engineer from Lima, Peru. And they only spent $25,000. I guarantee you that had they used a more traditional contracting mechanism, they would have spent a lot more. They might not have gotten an answer, and they certainly would not have gotten an answer from a retired mechanical engineer from Lima, Peru. So I think that this mechanism does allow the government to tap into a much broader community of solvers. With respect to your question about social media, I think a really interesting opportunity to use this is in those areas that would benefit from leveraging the small efforts of the many as opposed to the large efforts of the few. And I'll give you a historical example of this, something that I worked on for President Clinton, which was called Net Day. And the idea was, how could you get thousands of California schools wired, not by having one organization do it, but by having thousands of communities each take responsibility for one school. So similarly, I think a great thing to do would be to say, well, how could we increase the number of school and after-school programs that have a makerspace and have a set of tools and materials and have mentors that are having the students work on progressively more challenging hands-on projects. Now, if you said one entity has to be responsible for doing this for over 100,000 schools, that would be a Herculean effort. But if you could say, could you create a platform, things like Donors Choose, that makes that a massively parallel problem, and you've got online organizing for offline activism, I think that could be really interesting use of social media as opposed to trolls and people flaming each other.
Hi, I'd like to know, does the current White House have a similar position to yours?
So it is a matter of the public record that the number of people that are working at the organization that I work for has gone down from about 120 to 30, and that they have only appointed one person to OSTP. So it is currently not playing the role that it did during the Obama administration.
So one of the things I've been dying to ask is the White House should lead a group of scientists whenever there's a global emergency. I mean, a universal consortium of scientists that can solve the problems like Fukushima, yes, the oil. And I don't know of such a policy play. I mean, it should be a global thing with all these countries, the top, yeah, scientists. Has there ever been any thought of that or putting something like that together? I mean, the oil spill could have been averted by putting 2 aircraft carriers under the oil rig, and they should have figured out that if it sank, it was going to cause these problems. And we don't think as a global, Fukushima, they were too afraid to talk. If we get a core of top scientists around the world saying, this is a problem, when we have it, call them up. And you've got a decoder ring too. Yeah, no, I think there needs to be a decoder ring. This is one of the things where policies, I think, could have a big influence. Yeah, no, I think I mean, this does happen, but it happens on an ad hoc basis. And so a lot of times it's based on who happens to be in government. So for example, you know, in the oil spill context, we had a Nobel laureate, Steve Chu, you know, who knew a lot of scientists and engineers. And so there were lots of calls to try to figure out what to do. But I agree that it would be worthwhile thinking about how to, you know, do some scenario planning so that more of these relationships were in place. But I think realistically, there's still going to be an element of this, which is like,
pick up basketball, because who you need to have a conversation with is going to depend on what the nature of the disaster is. I think where we really need this is in the life sciences, because there's a long tradition of physicists, advising the government at the very highest levels. That tradition does not yet exist in the life sciences, and so sort of emerging infectious diseases and other things like that are real challenges.
Tom, I enjoyed your remarks about policy entrepreneurship, and I love that concept. Here at the university, and I'm sure in your realms as well, we often have to demonstrate impact with metrics. And I'm wondering what kind of metrics you found that are meaningful, and especially when you're trying to, as you say, lead a coalition of the willing. Like, how can you demonstrate that you have accomplished what you set out to accomplish? Yeah.
So in some cases, that is reasonably straightforward. So an example would be, we had an effort to prepare and recruit 100,000 high-quality math and science teachers over the next 10 years. So we could actually measure how we were doing towards that goal. In other cases, it is going to rely more on expert judgment to determine how much progress we're making and whether sort of continued investment is justified, because there is no single metric. And one of the problems is that sometimes having a single metric can backfire. So the French colonial government in Indochina wanted to address the problem that there were too many rats in Saigon. They established a bounty on rat tails, but this led to rat farms. There's actually a law that says, the more you rely on a metric to evaluate progress, the more likely it is that it can lead to sort of unintended consequences like that.
And this will be the final question.
So Tom, can you elaborate how do you kind of between the conflict between policy and the science? Because sometimes the policy comes first and then science, and sometimes science and the policy. And what is the danger of one actually over the other one? Yeah.
So part of this is that there is a difference between facts and values, between is and ought. So an example of this would be, there might be a scientific consensus, or at least rough consensus, about a particular natural phenomena, but you still might have a disagreement about what is the right thing to do in virtue of that. And what you want to avoid a situation where the policymakers are saying, and which has been known to happen in the intelligence process, this is the outcome that I want, now go out and get me some intelligence that justifies that. And so there is a difference between the world of science, which is trying to describe and explain what's going on, and the world of politics, which is about making choices. And it's not always the case that that the science tells you what to do. It's just that policymakers should be informed by the science when they're making those types of choices, and not be leaning on the scientists and saying, the right answer is X, now go out and find me some data that confirms what I already believe. Thank you.